crouched among the blue juniper and granite boulders, shivering as midnight danced on the high prairie. Above, a bleeding moon cast silver light across the valley. Dried grass crackled under her bare hands. For a woman who once wore silk in town parlours, this night was bitter. Her breathing was loud in her ears. She swallowed thin with the cold, biting at cracked lips crusted with blood. Around her, the hills beyond Silver Bluff sloped dark and empty. She had no lantern, only darkness. They had thrown her out at dawn, her skirts torn and collar undone, lonesome, one shoe missing. The town fathers of Silver Bluff had told her to vanish, never to speak her name again. Down the road behind her, the dim glow of lantern light faded. Horses' hooves clopped away into the morning fog. No man held her hand. No god had bowed her head in prayer. No mother sang for her. She had no husband, no name, no past. Only this present, cold stone under wrist and knee, and a shuddering silence to keep her company. Fear and shame had made her eyes hard. An orphan, an outcast, she carried secrets even she could not recall. Sometimes she dreamt of a black house aflame, and a man she could not name. But memory flared out as quick as it came, lost in smoke. The men of Silver Bluff said she was cursed, a bringer of bad luck. The churchmen spat on her skirts and called her a whore, and so she ran, or was made to run, into these hills to vanish beyond the reach of men who would judge her. The cold air stole what strength she had left. Her fingers curled numb around a gnarled willow stick she had grabbed to stay upright. She leaned against a pine, panting, hoping only for her heart to slow. Above her, the sky opened full and black, constellations clearing away the stars by their silent will. Her body ached in ways she could not name, ribs or arms, maybe a leg. Memory of pain was broken, no doctor to ask. Her life had collapsed faster than a campfire knocked by wind. They said she had killed their good preacher, had taken a lover in the churchyard, or worse, she had refused to tell her own story. Whichever it was, Silver Bluff had washed its hands of her. For hours she lay against the pine and watched dawn become a bruise along the horizon. She whispered to herself once, asking a question of the wide sky, then whimpered beneath the twilight. For too long she held nothing to hold her at all. At last, spent to the bones of her courage, she slept. At dawn's pale light, a lone rider crested the ridge above the valley. Weston Grady sat tall in his saddle, wrapped in an oilskin duster. Dust gathered at the hem of his boots from nights of restless wandering. The morning wind rattled the brim of his black hat. Beneath it, eyes like dark hawk feathers surveyed the valley with practiced caution. He spurred his horse to the edge of a wash, pulling the reins hard. The animal snorted in misted warmth. A keen eye saw something unusual, a flicker of movement among the juniper. Weston slid from saddle silently, his leather boots making no more sound than the whippoorwill's distant song. The outlaw's breath rolled out in cloud. He held a long whip in one hand and in the other a worn rifle, its butt scarred by old fire burns. Weston approached on foot, careful not to make too much noise. The earth smelled of sage and pine and recent rain. He found her kneeling by a pine, head bowed and arms bloody. A ragged figure, she could have been some lost waif from his dreams. Weston saw the bruises on her arms, the knots of bruised thorns in the grass. He checked the sky behind her, ears straining for any threat. Gently he eased the woman's chin upward. Her cloudy eyes blinked at his face, unfocused. "It's all right," he murmured quietly, though he knew she could not hear. She whimpered, curling tighter to the earth. Weston stooped low, wrapping one arm around her shoulders. Gently he lifted her. Her ragged limbs lay heavy across his neck and shoulder. The woman's head rested against him as he took his last steps toward the log cabin hidden in a clearing below. The cabin was small and old, logs weathered grey by years of sun and ice. Smoke curled from the crooked stone chimney as a fire burned low inside. No windows, but a single shutterless opening. He pushed open a door worn thin with use. Inside, the air held the scent of pine resin and old tobacco. A thin wisp of smoke from the fire rose to the rafters where bundles of dried herbs hung from the beams. Weston set the woman gently by the hearth. His movements were sure and careful. She moaned and shifted. "Hold still," he said softly, as he peeled her wet coat from her shoulders. Her bare arms had bruises and welts, her ribs too, but none seemed broken. Carefully, he tore a strip of cloth from a spare shirt and bound her arm and side. He ladled water from the kettle into a tin basin, washing mud and blood from her skin. The steam curled warm toward her face. She woke with a start, coughing. The cabin's shadows rushed around her. How long had it been? The stale cabin smelled of burning pine and wood smoke. She saw him there, standing by a rough cot, hat in hand. His face was tan, with a heavy stubble and tired eyes. He said nothing as she caught her breath and murmured a question. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but defiant. He answered only by pouring tea from a battered kettle into a spoon. Dipping it to her lips, he coaxed her to sip. The warmth of it soothed her throat. Outside, the wind shuffled through pines. She realized he carried a rifle. It lay silent in a corner. For a moment he met her eyes. There was no malice there, only something deep and wary. He kept his distance. "Weston," he finally said, almost as if introducing himself to the dawn. His voice was a soft rumble. "Rest. You're safe here." No more words followed. He stood by the cot, watching over her with a vigilant gentleness. She closed her eyes. Tonight, for the first time since Silver Bluff, the ache in her bones eased into sleep. She dreamed of distant summers, fields of grass and the sound of laughing children. But in truth, she barely slept at all. She simply lay on the cot and shut her eyes, letting hope creep in upon her. Weston quietly stepped outside into the night air. Pine needles crackled underfoot. The forest exhaled around him. He gathered a few spindles for the fire and fed the embers back to life, smoke rising in steady grey ribbons. The cabin was warm against the cool dawn, and in that light Weston let himself believe, however small, that perhaps this night's peace could last. Leaning against the cabin's rough wood, he watched the stars fade into a palette of violet and indigo. His jaw was tight. The loss behind those eyes trembled unspoken. But as the first light of morning brushed the horizon, a quiet hope kindled in his chest. They had lived one night without ghosts. In the woods behind the cabin, a groundhog crept from its hole. A whippoorwill called to another. Weston stood for a long moment, listening to the soft life stirring in the pines. "Tomorrow," Willow, the sleeping woman, had said once to herself. Weston promised himself softly that he would help her find what she sought. Days turned to weeks under a patient sky. Weston lit the stove each morning with flint and kindling. The dawn came softly over the mountains, a promise, and the girl would wake to find breakfast waiting. Sometimes it was simply dried meat and coffee, sometimes stew from a rabbit Weston had caught. The cabin was small, but there was warmth, pine smoke in the corners, the smell of coffee brewing on a hot iron plate, and the steady breathing of the woman who came back to life by it. For the first week, her words were like tender sprouts pushing through cold ground. "Water," she whispered one morning, barely louder than a sigh. Still he understood, wordless. He handed her the tin cup, and the gentle morning sun caught in her eyes as she drank. He rarely answered her questions, but Willow felt no silence more profound than the comfort of his steady presence. When hunger took her throat, he would finish his own meal and quietly push the plate toward her. Together at the low wooden table by night, she would share small things, salt from the keg, a crust of bread, and some of the spicy biscuits he made. In the firelight, sometimes she tried to hum an old hymn from memory. He listened to her attempts with closed eyes, as if learning the melody in his silence. He named her then, and the name took root. In the days that followed, whenever the wind sighed through the lodgepole pines around their cabin, Willow thought she could almost hear her name rustling among the branches. Her voice grew stronger. "Thank you," she told him one cool morning. He only replied, "Morning," already turning to stoke the fire. His response came with a gentle smile that warmed her more than the sunlight on her face. Weston never asked about the world she had left behind. Instead, Willow found herself telling him stories of this one. She mended his shirt sleeves, patching the tear where a rabbit's arrow had snagged it long ago. He watched quietly as she wove thread in and out, the lamp casting golden light on her patient face. Outside, spring trickled into summer. High peaks still wore snow, but wildflowers flooded the valley floor. Dusk arrived with colors on their cabin wall, amethyst and rose swirling through the smoke. Each evening, Willow sat by the fire as Weston repaired the log walls or tuned his old guitar. He had taught himself to play chords out of loneliness, and sometimes she hummed along as he strummed softly. These were small miracles between them, silences filled with shared breath and quiet gratitude. For a week at a time, Willow said little. One stormy night, lightning clawed down the sky, casting Weston's jagged shadow on the wall. Willow hesitated by the doorway, feeling his shoulders tense. Instead of speaking, she simply sat beside him and laid a steady hand on his arm. In the sweep of thunder, he drew her closer into his coat without a word. Outside, the wind peeled back the pines, but inside that little log cabin they were warm and unafraid. She noticed his scars every day. She asked once, voice soft, "What burned you?" Weston did not answer immediately. He continued to smooth a circle in the ragged hearthstone with one forefinger. Finally he said only, "Fire." The single word fell like ash between them. Willow nodded, not pushing for more. She realized then that he had lost more to flames than their winter hearth would ever hold. Without another word, Willow reached out and gently traced the scar. He flinched at her touch, but he did not pull away. The silence that followed held more healing than any answer could have. One morning, Willow unfolded a yellowed letter by the fire. Its edges were burnt ragged. The script was her husband's careful hand. Weston stirred at the sound of paper. Willow kept reading aloud, a goodbye filled with love, a confession of fear. Weston drew in a breath, his hands clenching the wood of the table. Willow sensed the memories flicker behind his eyes and then vanish like smoke on the breeze. When the letter's tears fell into ink, she reached for him. He only took the page and held it to the firelight. They both watched it burn quietly. That night, as rain splattered on the roof, Weston knelt by the cabin's doorway. Willow found him with a hat and blanket in hand. He offered her the blanket wordlessly. Warm and dry under his coat, she slipped her arm through his. In the dark, they built a fire and listened to the quiet of the storm. When a thunderclap made the cabin groan, Willow whispered, "I am here." Weston did not answer with words. He just held her tighter until dawn. Summer passed. They learned to trust the calm. They gathered berries from the hillside, and Willow taught Weston the tune of a river she remembered. In return, he taught her to sit in silence and hear the truth in the crackle of wood. She could live without her past now. Her only home was this sanctuary with Weston. He needed no voice to know her soul, and that became enough. A wind had risen by dawn. Willow hugged the doorframe as horses crowded outside, dust blowing up around their hooves like ash. Two riders in dirty star-emblazoned vests dismounted, revolvers at their hips. Through the cabin doorway she glimpsed the sheriff of Silver Bluff, a tall, thin man with a sour mouth and watchful eyes. Weston stepped slowly from the cabin, blotting his eyes on a sleeve. His hands were empty. She moved beside him, her name now on her lips. The sheriff sneered, "Weston Grady, come out with your hands up. We know that woman's right there with you." Willow's heart pounded. Weston did not even flinch. He turned to her in the quiet dawn. "Who are you?" the sheriff demanded, nodding at Willow. Dust clung to her hair. She squared her shoulders. "They call me Willow," she said softly, voice steadier than she felt. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. A deputy raised his pistol, but Weston remained motionless. The sheriff spat out the lie he'd heard in town, bitter and loud. "A fugitive and a mystery woman. They say you run like ghosts." He circled them, guns lightly held, searching their faces. "Answer me, woman," he said to Willow. "Who were you before this?" Willow felt Weston's hand on her shoulder. He did not pull her back. She took a careful step forward. "My name is Willow," she said, voice firm, "and my past stays in the shadows where it belongs." The men in blue exchanged glances. One deputy's fingers itched on the trigger. The sheriff cocked his head. "So you've shed your old life," he mused. "Shedding can be hard." He nodded at Weston. "He's yours, Sheriff," he said to the deputies. "No need for violence if you come quietly." Another long moment passed. Willow stood with Weston side by side. "We came for the law, not your souls," the sheriff said at last, voice gruff, then softer. "Your name?" "I'll take that." He gave a curt nod and turned away. "All right, we're done here." With that, the riders mounted up. Willow exhaled. Sunrise flooded through the cabin doorway. Weston slid an arm around her shoulders. They looked out at the quiet hills. The cabin stood silent behind them. Before them, the wide world waiting. The past remained unspoken in the valley air. They had each other. That was enough. They broke camp by the rising sun and set off for the east. The forest gradually gave way to rolling prairies and one great meadow shining golden in the morning. Willow leaned over her saddle to watch the fields stretch out green to gold below them. Nothing from Silver Bluff remained, only wide sky and the whisper of tall grass around their horses' flanks. At midday, Weston halted for a rest. Willow knelt by a roadside spring and dipped her hands into the cold water. The cool rush brought a smile to her face. Across the meadow, a lone hawk circled against the blue. Weston watched the bird for a moment, then offered Willow a drink from his flask. She accepted gratefully, feeling the clean water soothe her throat. There was a gentle peace around them. A wisp of smoke on the breeze told of a distant cabin or hearth. "That's a sign of life," Weston observed quietly. Willow nodded. Somewhere out there people lived their lives, and here they were free to live theirs. They made a simple camp in the afternoon shade of a cottonwood by a winding creek. Weston gathered kindling while Willow broke bread from their provisions. Together they warmed the last of their stew and shared a humble meal. The sky was a deep blue vault overhead. Silence felt comfortable about them. Finally Weston spoke. "Almost there," he said, almost to himself. "Seems like it." All around the world was still. In that stillness Willow felt hope put down roots in her heart. By dusk they crested a gentle ridge. Below them lay another open valley framed by distant mountain pines and dotted with grazing horses. The low sun turned the tall grasses to shimmering gold and the edges of the mountains purple. Weston helped Willow down from her horse. She walked the last few paces barefoot, feeling earth cool beneath her soles. Among the rocks a cluster of tiny asters grew. Willow picked a few purple blooms and tucked them behind Weston's ear. He gave a wry grin and threw his arm around her. Together they watched the sun sink into sleep. Night came early. They built a campfire in a clearing by the creek, embers glowing like distant stars. Willow lay close to Weston on an old blanket. He wrapped her shawl around them. "I'm cold," she joked quietly. He said nothing, simply pulled her in tighter. In the dark hush, only the crackle of fire and their steady breathing filled the air. Outside, a lone cricket sang, and Willow joined in with a soft hum, a lullaby from her childhood. Weston closed his eyes, the tune weaving into the night sky. By the flickering firelight, she saw a peaceful smile on his face. All at once, Willow realized this life, uncertain and silent as it was, felt like something she could finally grasp. Here by his side, fear had no foothold. She traced a finger along Weston's scarred cheek, leaving a promise on his skin with her touch. He opened his eyes to meet hers. Gently, she said the truth in her heart. "We'll stay, won't we?" Weston's breath caught. Willow heard the answer without it. "Yes," he whispered. "We stay." They stood under the night sky together. The world beyond the ridge slept on quietly. Gone were thunder and chase, only peace remained. Willow leaned against Weston, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Dawn had long turned darkness to silence now. They had each other, and that was enough for whatever the morning would bring. They exhaled the last of their worries, believing anything was possible. For a moment they allowed themselves to believe in tomorrow. Nothing was left to do but to live peacefully with the dawn. After all they'd been through, this peace was theirs. Two broken people on the edge of a quiet life.